Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us today for part 2 of our webinar series, Capture the Impact of Your Work in Local Food Systems. Last week's webinar was our part 1, and we covered what metrics to track and why they matter. This week in part 2, we're going to talk about how to track the metrics and communicate the story, including some tools and technology you might use to help with your metrics tracking. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We do have a chat box, and we would love it if you would go there and enter in a little bit of information, kind of introduce yourself, you know, your name, maybe your farm name or organization that you're with would be great, and also your location. Please do that in our chat box whenever that is convenient for you. Also, we'll be fielding questions in our chat box throughout the webinar. We'll have a couple of points where we take Q&A, and just due to the volume of people on the call, we'd love it if you could put your questions in the chat box as they come to you, and we will make sure that we get those answered throughout the presentation. Currently, everyone on the call is unmuted through our webinar software, and that's so that we can hear our presenters and they can jump in and chime in when it's their turn to do so. But if you're a participant on the call, please be sure that your cell phone or phone that you're calling in on or the computer that you're on is muted so that we can minimize any background noise throughout the presentation. That would be great. We would appreciate that. Okay. Well, as people trickle in here, I think we'll go ahead and get started since we are now at 11:02. And I'm going to kick this over to Mary Oldham with the Value Chain Cluster Initiative to get our presentation started. Thanks everyone for being here.
All right, thanks everybody. Liberty, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. Testing, 1, 2. All right. Welcome everybody again. Thank you for your time being here today. This is, like Liberty said, this is the second part of a 2-part series. So the webinar last week was recorded, and you should have received an email with that recording. So if you weren't able to join us last week, we hope you're able to review that recording, and please let us know if you have any questions. We're also going to be taking some time to see if anybody has any questions about that today as well. Just to kind of recap, this webinar series came out of a pilot project for impact tracking that we've begun in West Virginia around local food systems, and several partners have contributed to this webinar and the pilot project in general. We've got rural support partners, Natural Capital Investment Fund and the Value Chain Cluster Initiative, the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition, AceNet, Downstream Strategies, Unlimited Future, Inc., Central Appalachian Network are the main partners that have helped put this together today, and we're using the WealthWorks framework as kind of the basis for this metrics tracking, which Andrew will talk a little bit more about. This webinar has been made possible through funding from the USDA and the Appalachian Regional Commission. Next slide, please. So just to review the objectives for this webinar series, between the last webinar and this webinar, we kind of set out to understand our collective interest in tracking food system metrics and impacts in West Virginia, to explore tools, best practices, and lessons learned for impact metrics and tracking, to build capacity at the organizational level and build the collective capacity to participate in the collaborative effort, which is the West Virginia Pilot Project. But of course, participation in that project is definitely optional and is not required to attend this training. We'll be providing a little bit more about that and how to get involved in it as well later on this webinar. And then the final goal is to kind of set the direction, including expanded indicators for that pilot project, the West Virginia Impact Tracking Project. Next slide, please. So today's webinar agenda, we're going to be covering norms and guidelines for collecting information, some tools and software options for collecting data, A big focus of this particular webinar is on telling the story. So once we've collected the metrics and the information, how do we communicate that impact to different audiences? And then another step of today is what are the next steps for the West Virginia pilot project? And we're also going to be providing a short survey for folks that are interested to weigh in on how you'd like to be involved. Next slide, please. All right, so to just give an overview of who you'll be hearing from today, Liberty Newberry-Fetty, who kind of introduced us here, is with VC2, and she's going to be running the software and kind of serving as MC, so thanks, Liberty. This is Mary Oldham with the Value Chain Cluster Initiative. I'm going to pass it over here in a minute to Andrew Crossan with Rural Support Partners and Leslie Schaller with ACENET, Appalachian Center for Economic Networks. They are both with the CAN network and have a wealth of experience with impact tracking and have a lot to share with us today. Also, Spencer Moss from the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition is going to be sharing some about their policy work with us today. And Gabby Scrofano is also with the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition and is going to be helping woman the chat box. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat box and we'll be fielding those throughout the webinar to make sure that we get questions answered. Annie Stroud is also joining us from Downstream Strategies, and Gail Patton from Unlimited Future. Next slide, please. All right, I think I'm going to kick this over to you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mary. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Hopefully most of you were able to attend the first webinar last week. This was intended as sort of a two-part series. When we started down this path of all the things we wanted to talk about related to data collection impacts, we realized it was just too much for one webinar. And so we split it into these two different webinars. And the first one really focused on the data itself, different metrics, different numbers, how and why you go about collecting the information that you collect to understand impacts in work like local food systems development. This second webinar, as Mary just shared, is going to be more about the how, more about the norms and guidelines for collecting data, the tools and software for collecting data, and the audiences and messaging, what you do with the data once you have it. But just a quick review of what we covered on the first webinar. There is a recording of that full webinar, which is just under 2 hours long, probably about 1:45, I think, in the trimmed down version. And there's a stable link that has been shared out with everybody who registered for the webinars. And so if you're on this webinar, you'll get that link as well, along with the recording of this webinar. So they are intended to be viewed or engaged with in that order if you're able. So a few things we did. We started out with a little bit of background. We heard from the folks at VC2 and Food and Farm Coalition and other West Virginia partners about their impact pilot. This is a collaborative impact tracking project where they started to build out this network of food system support actors who were all trying to grow the local food economy, increase income for producers, increase business development opportunities, et cetera, and they decided to try to start measuring some of what they were all doing and contribute data that they were each collecting individually. And so that has turned into this impact pilot project. And one of the things we talked a lot about last week was where it's going to go from here, and we'll circle back to that in this call. We also told the story of CAN, of the Central Appalachian Network, which is a regional network that's been around for over 20 years now and has been doing local food systems work for about 10 years, all the way from Ohio through West Virginia, East Kentucky, down to Virginia and Tennessee, focused on the Appalachian counties of those states. And the members of CAN and the partners of CAN have been doing food systems development work for a long time and have been tracking their impact in that work. And so we talked about sort of what CAN has been tracking, what the numbers show in terms of growth over the years of these different indicators, and why that's important, what we've been able to do with those numbers, who we've shared them with, and then what we've learned. Sort of, it's not all been smooth sailing. We've had some had to change course a few times and had to make some adjustments along the way. So all of that sort of was shared out as a story of why it's worth collecting data and what you might get out of it and why it's worth the trouble. And we also talked a little bit about this thing called WealthWorks, which is this ever-evolving national network and framework that is really useful for doing. It's designed for rural community economic development work, and it is especially useful for sectors. So sectors like the local food system, and it's a tool and a framework to help you assess, plan, and evaluate work in rural communities. And what we talked about specifically is how you use that framework to identify the impacts that you want to track, identify the forms of wealth that those impacts are changing or affecting, and then identify the indicators or the measures that you're going to use to show change over time in the impacts that you're trying to create. And then the very last thing, and this is the thing that we spent the most time on, was talking about indicators themselves. So we talked about recommendations that this group of CAN members and West Virginia partners made around what we think the most important, impactful, valuable, informative indicators are for West Virginia actors to track. And as Mary shared at the outset, that's on two levels. We think those are valuable indicators for organizations and individual actors and entities just to understand sort of the change that you're making, the difference that you're making in your work. And we think it's a good fit for this collaborative, broader systems level statewide work. So with multiple organizations contributing, participating, we all want to be on the same page about what we're collecting. So I'm going to talk through what those specifically are here on this next slide. Liberty, if you could advance it. So for the recommendations, we basically looked at a series of impacts that we want to create or that we want to track. We want to be able to say that we're having these results. And for each of those, we talked about the indicators, what you're actually going to measure or count. Right? So each of these impacts is a thing that needs to be measured. And so we talked through each of them. We talked about what the thing we're trying to count is, who probably is the best fit for counting that type of indicator, how you would go about doing it, and then what it shows or what the message is associated with that indicator. So here on the left side, you can see all the different metrics. And for each of those, we have an indicator. So producer revenue. We want to understand how much farmers are making. And the way that we understand that is by what we'd suggest is aggregated sales revenue by entity. So rather than calling up every single farmer around the state and asking them how much they're selling, use the existing entities that you have, the markets, the food hubs, the grower associations, the retail stores, to understand how much producers are selling through each of those. That gives us several things. It gives us consistency because we know we're not double counting producers. It also gives us anonymity because producers aren't being named by name. They're getting aggregate numbers through each entity. We also want to understand how many producers we're talking about here. How many farmers are engaged in this work in West Virginia? And so the thing that we would count there are the number of producers participating in markets, so selling through these different intermediaries, selling into these different markets, and also the number of producers who are participating in training events, in receiving technical assistance, receiving business coaching, or whatever other form of support that these support actors are providing. Another thing we want to understand is how the system itself is growing. So food hubs, intermediaries, other pieces of the system that help to connect farmers to consumers and markets. And so what we're counting there are the number of participating entities, and that number has grown across West Virginia just over the past couple of years. Employment and job creation, that's something that everybody cares about, and so it's really important to figure out how to track that. And our recommendation for what to actually count, the indicator for that one, is full-time equivalent jobs. So using fractions for part-time or seasonal work, so that you come up with this total that's a big, robust number of the number of folks who are employed in local food production across West Virginia. And one important note is that we always want to make sure that that includes farmers as well, right? So if it's not a full-time job, that's fine, but farmers often forget to count themselves as a job and as a form of employment. Buyer purchasing behavior. We want to understand how buyers how mainstream demand is changing. And the way that we understand that or measure that is we look at the amount of purchasing and the number of buyers who are wholesale or institutional buyers. So your grocery store chains, your produce brokers, your hospitals, universities, school systems, etc., to sort of show how this local food demand is going to the mainstream and is increasing in scale and becoming really a large-scale economic sector. Community engagement and participation, that's one of the intangible things that's really valuable about the local food system, this level of community support and participation. And so one of the ways, and there's lots of different ways to collect this, is to count the number of events that are held and the number of participants in those events. So trainings, workshops, community meals, food festivals, things like that, that are all sort of ways for consumers to show their support for the local food system and for their local farmers. Food access and food security, that's another really important one. We want to show that the local food system is helping to increase public health through access to healthy, fresh, local foods. And so one of the easiest ways to measure that is that there's this whole category of sales that are using programs, incentive programs, vouchers, things like that. And so if we can track the number of sales to subsidize consumers, so consumers who are using some form of subsidy to purchase local foods, that gives us a sense of how much of those local food sales are going to increase food security among food insecure populations. Another one, farmland conservation and sustainability. This is about natural resource conservation, land, soil, water, etc. And the easiest thing to measure here is just the acreage and production. And when CAN has done this, we've also measured the type of production, right? So is it certified organic, or is it non-certified but chemical-free, or is it conventional and uses chemicals or pesticides, to understand how many acres are being developed or produced from, and then what the nature of that production is on those acres. And then the last one is financial investment and financial viability. This is an economic sector, and it needs money going into it and coming out of it. So we want to understand how much money is going into the local food system, what kind of investors it's coming from, and what it's going towards. And so the easiest thing to count is the number of investors and the investment amounts. So we're looking at things like loans for a new piece of equipment, or a new building, or investing some profits, if they exist, into renting more land, or purchasing some additional land, or buying marketing materials, or any sort of thing that producers or food and farm businesses invest in to grow their enterprise, or shared use infrastructure, things like processing facilities, community kitchens, food hubs, trucks that are used by multiple producers. Those are really important investments that help the food system to grow to scale. And so we want to understand where that's happening, where that money is coming from, and how much each year. So that's a lot of information. Just to remind folks of what we talked about on the last webinar, again, if you go back and look at that recording, we unpack each of those and spend about 5 or 10 minutes on each one of those. So there's a lot more information on that first webinar. So I think if we go to the next slide, we're going to pause here and see if folks have questions on that first webinar. And again, if you could enter your questions into the chat box, and we'll clarify anything that folks aren't clear about from the first webinar.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we're going to have just take a few minutes here, as Andrew said, to answer any questions carrying over from the first webinar, or any information that Andrew just went over about the first webinar and what we covered. So if you could enter your questions in the chat box, I think we're going to have Gabby from the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition is going to help moderate that for us and let us know if any questions are coming through.
So far, there are no questions coming onto the chat box.
Hi, Liberty. This is Leslie. Since I'm on the phone and can't see the chat box, I do have a question. I'm wondering if other people have recently started to collect any indicators around public and private investment in their local food economies.
Great. Okay. So, yes, from Leslie Schaller with AceNet, the question was, has anyone started to collect information about investment? You said public and private investment in your local food economy. So if you have any feedback about that and you would like to enter that into the chat box, we will keep an eye on that. Also, just to remind folks, if you joined us recently, please enter in your name and organization name, your location, into the chat box, just so we kind of have a sense of who all's with us today. Thanks. And we'll have a couple other points. Yeah.
Yeah, it might be good to go ahead and move on. We'll pause after each section, and folks can enter questions as we go along, but we'll pause after each section to take questions, and then we'll open things up at the end as well. So please do contribute your questions to the chat box as you have them. All right, I think we're ready to launch into this first section. Yeah.
Okay.
So the first big chunk of today's webinar, we want to talk about norms and guidelines for collecting information. So I just named all the different pieces of information and data that we might want to collect. Some of the what and the why of that, but this is all about the how, right? And there's two categories when we think about norms and guidelines for collecting data that are really important about how you do it. The first is consistency, the consistency of the data. The whole rhyme and reason of data collection is so that you can accurately communicate your impact. And so it's really important that that data be consistent and credible, and you be able to explain how you got it, et cetera. So a few notes on that, and we're going to have some good examples from folks on the call about each of these. But first, we got to make sure we're all counting the same things. We can't be counting apples and oranges and then throwing it all in a basket together. It's got to be one-to-one. That's why we say things like, if you're counting jobs, count full-time equivalent jobs so that you can use fractions for part-time jobs, right? So that you don't have some folks counting full-time jobs and some folks counting seasonal jobs as full-time, et cetera. Another issue with counting the same things is producers. Oftentimes, there's only so many farmers, and oftentimes the farmer is working with multiple organizations or with multiple markets. And so we don't want to count the same farmer 3 times. And so one of the ways that you get around that is the second point, which is to use transactional and established entities, which often are existing markets or food hubs or retailers or grower groups who already have systems to build on. That's for several reasons. A, it just saves work. B, it is much more reliable to have a group of institutions, entities, whatever, intermediaries, whatever you want to call them, that are already established, that are counting this stuff year after year regardless. And so when we ask them to participate in some sort of collaborative impact tracking project like the one we're doing in West Virginia, they're really building on what they're already doing. They're getting better at what they're doing, and they're able to contribute data that's consistent. And if we're using transactional entities to count sales, then we don't have to worry about double counting those producers, because what they're selling through one entity, they're not selling that same product through a different entity. So it's okay to count both because they're not overlapping. And then the third thing is, again, one of the benefits of using folks who are already collecting some form of data is that we can build on it. We can track we can track a broader array of impacts without doing too much extra work, just by making sure that what we're counting is aligned, that we're talking about the same things, that we're counting the same numbers, and then we can aggregate that and show how it all adds up to more than the sum of its parts. So there's a whole category around the consistency of the data, and we'll talk about some of the lessons learned in that category. And then there's another whole category of norms and guidelines and principles around the engagement with the producers and trust and relationships in that engagement with the producers. This is local food system is an industry and an economy that is built on trust, it is built on relationships. And so that needs to be part of our thinking about data collection as well. And so a couple core things to keep in mind here when you're engaging with producers or food businesses. Communicate with them about the why you're doing this, why this is in their interest to participate, to be part of this bigger picture collaborative effort. It's that when the local food system grows, it benefits all producers. And so if we can show that it's growing, those benefits come back all the way to the ground in terms of supportive policies, in terms of buyers getting more engaged, in terms of consumers getting more informed and engaged, in terms of funders and investors putting more money into the system. So helping folks see the shared interest in participating and sharing their data as part of this collective effort. And then the other piece is that it's really important to respect privacy of these farms. Oftentimes it's very personal. The finances of a small farm are very tied in with the finances of the family, and so it's really important to respect that, to ensure privacy, to make sure that they're confident in how their information is going to be managed, and assume that everyone wants to be anonymous. So assume anonymity and preserve that. There may be exceptions. There may be farms that say, yeah, I want my story told. I want to be an inspiring story or a cautionary tale or whatever else, and they open themselves up a little bit more. But I think in general, it's good to promise and preserve anonymity. And one of the best ways to do that is by keeping data aggregated as opposed to separated out for individual producers. So be thinking about those two categories, and we're going to hear some examples. We're going to hear from some West Virginia partners. We're going to hear from Wild Ramp. We're going to hear from VC2. We're going to hear from Spreading Farms and Downstream Strategies, and from AceNet as well. So if you can go to the next slide, I think Wild Ramp is the first one. So Gail, are you with us to talk about this?
I am. Thank you, Andrew. We find that it's very easy, since we have a point of sale system, to track sales data. We can do numbers of producers, numbers of transactions. We can see when the busiest times of the day are for the market. So we can drill down pretty deep into all of our sales data. We can tell how many producers we have from Ohio versus Kentucky versus West Virginia. We just have a lot of data that we can do. But where we run into a little bit of a challenge, maybe is the right word, it's harder to know total sales data from producers, because many of them sell at the Wild Ramp, they sell on their own farms, they may have their own CSA, they may sell at other farmers markets, which we hope would be reported. So even though we're able to definitively say this is how much X farmer sold at the Wild Ramp last year, that does not always reflect, and almost always never doesn't reflect, their entire income or the entire sale. And then it gets even more complicated when we, as Unlimited Future, Refresh Appalachia, other service providers or third parties are counting their clients who happen to be the same clients as the Wild Ramp. So it's been very helpful for me to be on this webinar and to talk and to learn from you guys about how to track. You start with the sales data, and then we can build on that maybe later, but that's just the easy kind of cherry picking piece of the pie that we can do right away. So those are the lessons that we've learned so far, and we're looking forward to learning lots more as we go along. So I'll pass it back to you, Andrew.
Great. Yeah, so y'all can see that this is something that, when I say transactional entity, WildRamp is a great example of that, right? They're buying product from local producers and selling it, so there's a set of things that they're able to do pretty easily using their existing systems, and then there's some things that are more complicated in terms of how they plug in with other organizations who are also participating in the system and buying and selling oftentimes from the same producers. So thanks for that example, Gail. And I think next is a VC2 example.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So we're a little bit different than the WildRamp, of course, in the sense that we are not operating a market. We are a technical assistance provider. So our interest in collecting good information is to track how our work is having an impact and how our clients and partners are growing, to make sure that we're having impact that is desired. So we have definitely learned a couple of things over the years in terms of collecting information from our clients and being respectful of privacy and learning how to do that in a way that we can track that impact. So in terms of norms and relations, we have really learned that the tools and the timing of how we collect data are very critical to getting good data, or actually any at all. So I think there's a tendency to, when we get started with data collection, everybody wants to get a lot of different kinds of information, and we just need to be careful about overwhelming people with requests for information. And I think we're trying to improve that at VC2 by not bombarding people with surveys or requests for information. And I think that is particularly important in cases where you're working directly with farmers. So the other thing we've learned is that asking for impact evaluation measures is more difficult than asking for what I would refer to as outcome or post-event evaluation. And what I mean by that is that, if someone comes to a training, it's easy to give them a survey and ask how that training might impact them, or, it's easier to, if you provide technical assistance to someone, it's easier to ask that person, how many jobs do you currently have this year, and then ask them the following year, how many jobs do you currently have, because they're benefiting from the services that you're providing, and they see the value in what you're trying to track. What we've found is that it's much harder to track impact further down the road. So if we've worked with an organization or a client or producer, what's really interesting is to see that sometimes this impact really takes a long time to show up, right? So a business might not see might not be able to add jobs in the second year, but maybe 5 years down the road, they've had 4 or 5 jobs added to their business. And so, in the cases where we've had ongoing relationships with those folks, it's been really interesting to see the impact and be able to track that. But it still is challenging to maintain that relationship and respect people's time in terms of, asking them to provide information. But we found that the people that really see the value in measuring that impact are very happy to participate in that. So we're just always trying to improve the amount, kind of shorten the amount of time that those engagements take so that it's easy for people to participate. Another thing I think we've learned in terms of consistency is just making sure people know what you're asking for. So especially with regard to that point about investments, on our surveys, we've asked people, how much private investment have you made in your business over the course of the last year? And I think sometimes people just need a little bit more information about what that means. Are we talking about marketing materials? Are we talking about cold storage, and giving some examples? So we've definitely seen kind of a range of different types of answers that have indicated to us that people interpret that question differently sometimes. So what we've been trying to do is to give examples or kind of put parameters in what we're asking so that we get consistent information so that people know what we're asking and that we can track things consistently, right? So the other one that I think Andrew already mentioned was the one about employment. You know, farmers notoriously don't consider what they do as a job, right? So one thing we noticed through VC2 is that we always have to remind people to count themselves as well. I think one thing we can do, no matter what kind of data you're collecting or who you're trying to work with in that regard, I think it's often very helpful to do kind of a small trial of any kind of survey tool that you're going to use to actually collect the data. So that's actually a very standard practice in research when people are conducting surveys, is to conduct like a small focus group or trial the survey with a couple people just to see how different people interpret the questions or answer them before you cast the net so wide and get just a range of data. And I think another way to conduct a survey is to do it kind of interview style, which of course takes much more time, so I'm not sure I would recommend that, but it is a way to be able to kind of walk people through the questions and get consistent answers. So I think if you're just starting out with data collection, it might be helpful to just try it out with a few people and see how people react to the questions before casting the net pretty wide. So that'd be our experience.
One comment before we hear from Sprouting Farms as well. The point about timing is a really good one that I hadn't thought to mention. I know with CAN, we've had to adjust the timing. We collect different pieces of data at different times of the year. So in Ohio, for example, there are a lot of Amish and Mennonite farmers who sell at a produce auction out there in Southeast Ohio, and oftentimes these folks don't have phone access. They certainly don't have internet or email. And so the only way to get data from them is to get it in person. And the way that you're going to see them in person is during the growing season. And so there's a whole sort of methodology of getting data from that type of farmer. Other farmers who are connected, they're going to be on the internet, they're going to be accessible by phone. The off season, the winter, is probably actually the best time to gather data from them, because it's when things are slower. They're not in the rush of getting seeds in the ground or getting crops to market or whatever the case may be. So just a note to think about timing and to adapt to what works for you, because it's going to be a little bit different depending on the group that you're working with and the role that you play. So great point.
Thanks.
All right. Hey, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I can hear you.
Oops. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Great. Cool. Awesome. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Annie Strada, Downstream Strategies. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about is Sprouting Farms, and kind of, it's a new program that just got started last year. So we're very much in startup phase still. And, I want to share a little bit about what we've been thinking as far as evaluation and what that looks like. So there's, I think another thing to think about if you are a program, if you are, a food hub or something, is there's the different levels. There's like, what are the metrics that are great for sharing on the big, statewide level, and then what are the metrics that you're tracking for your own program? So for an example, the information that as an incubator farm makes sense for us to track and share on a statewide level and maybe aggregate with everybody has to do with how many folks we have in our program. Right? So maybe we have 2 apprentices this year, and we have, however many farms renting on our space and things like that. Whereas kind of in comparison to the stuff that as a program we hope to track, which includes, the actual learning progress of students. And, there's books and books about how to evaluate specific learning, but once you aggregate that data, you don't need that level of detail because it wouldn't be really feasible to gather that from everybody. So that's not as useful of a metric on the larger scale, but really important for us programmatically to make sure that our program is effective and that our students are actually learning what they need to do. And the other point I wanted to kind of talk about in this case too is, I think especially when programs are getting started, and kind of echoing what Gail was saying about start with what's possible, what you're able to track, and add from there. So we have a community education program And the way that what we do is we track how many people attend each educational event and then put that into a spreadsheet. And, I think in a best case scenario, we would be able to say, this is how many farmers our program affects. But of course, there's a lot of overlap between the different educational events with who comes and who doesn't, and it's not feasible for us at this point to track who came and sort through email addresses to see who was there and who wasn't, to have a total number of people in our area. But what we can say is, we had a certain number of learning engagements with farmers or community members. So what the aggregate number that we can share, looks like the number of times producers were in contact with educational material that we provided or that we facilitated. So we're still able to kind of give a meaningful aggregate number, even if it's not necessarily the first to track when thinking about community engagement and education in that way. So yeah, starting, once again, just starting where you are tracking, where it's easy to get information, especially getting started, and then thinking about that more strategically as the program kind of builds out as to how you can track it a little bit closer to what you'd like to do. So I think that's what I have for Sprouting Farms, and I think I'm on the next slide too. Is that correct?
Yes, we have downstream strategies for the next slide, Annie.
Okay. So again, this is still me. But this time I'm having kind of a different hat, I guess. So the work that I do at Downstream, we do a lot of statewide and regional research. And I want to talk a little bit about data consistency here. Again, just echoing the importance of being so clear about what you are actually gathering and aggregating as an organization or as a food hub or as something like that, because when you're looking at producer sales and when you're looking at number of people engaged, when you're looking at these things, those are all indicators on this broader scale of how great the system's doing, right? That's the whole point of this collaborative impact tracking. When you start looking at research studies or feasibilities or anything like that, when we get information from folks, usually we get aggregated data, often from food hubs, sometimes from surveys and things like that. And it's really important that we're able, and that the people who gather the data are able to tell us how that information came, because otherwise we aren't able to use it in a meaningful way, or we aren't able sometimes to use it at all if we can't kind of verify where it came from. So I guess a couple examples, and this is a little bit outside of telling the local food story, but I think it really matters because you can use this kind of information to really make the case for further funding and that kind of stuff. Examples of kind of consistency issues that I've run into over the years, just to think about if you're working with any of these types of folks, are, and it can be really different on the sector, but sometimes when you create a survey, like Mary said, it's sometimes a good idea to run it by some people in the industry or in the field that you're going to be doing, because kind of a test survey might bring up some of these challenges that you otherwise wouldn't see until after you'd already heard back from 50 people and you can't use half your data. So the first example is we did a study talking to meat processors with Gale and Unlimited Futures. And one of the things that happened there is, there was an interview process of a whole bunch of different meat processors all over the region. And there was a question about capacity, so how many animals they could process a day. And what we ran into is that some processors count their capacity in the number of cattle they can do, some do it in the number of weight, some in just the total number of animals. But if you aren't familiar with meat processing, there's a huge variance in the amount of time it takes to process a larger animal like a bison or a cattle versus a smaller animal like a sheep or a hog. So when you get that information back as a researcher, it's hard to say and figure out what the capacity is when everyone's answering that question a slightly different way. So that's a case where we could have, if it's an interview process, really clear instructions for the person asking the questions. But if it's a survey, even though it seems like a lot of words, sometimes it's really important to put specifics, like let me know your capacity in this specific way, so that you're able to actually aggregate that data in a meaningful way. The same thing happens all the time with food hubs and distributors and buyers. We did a distributor survey for a study for our CBI, the Hub Connectivity Study. And once again, when people are talking about what they want to buy or the quantities that they order in, between different buyers, you might get, I need broccoli in cases, in pounds, in flats. You know, there's a whole bunch of variance in how people talk about quantity. So when you're asking those questions, you have to be really clear that you're saying, let me know in pounds, or let me know in cases. And this is what a case means, because there's a bunch of different case sizes. So there's just a lot of variance there. So again, way back on the asking side, being really conscious that you're being clear about what that is. Let's see. Same thing, I guess, again, with food hubs, food banks especially, often measure food in pounds. You know, when we talk about some of these metrics with food hubs, often we're talking about sales data, you know, and just once again, being clear with that. And also, if you have a survey that doesn't specify what it is, sometimes people will enter information and not specify if it is pounds or if it is dollars, and you're just left with a blank number that could be significant, but you're not sure if it doesn't have the information, so you end up not being able to use it. And then once again, just to reiterate, I think it's been said, I think it can't hurt to say again, when you're talking about job-related numbers, also be aware that a lot of people aren't familiar with the full-time equivalent terminology. So explaining that in a way that makes sense, you know, because it's not, I think, common knowledge, and that's one thing that I know that I'm pretty bad about as somebody that works in this a lot. That we just use that terminology, but when you actually are going out and talking to your producers or your, you know, the folks that you're serving, they may or may not actually know exactly what that means. So you really want to explain it so they're not confused, and so they can actually like figure it out. Because if they don't quite know what you're asking, they're not going to be able to give you an accurate answer, which then down the road for your impact measurement survey that you're filling out for the statewide program or for your future grant proposals, or when you're talking to your funders, you're not going to have necessarily an accurate representation of what's really going on with your folks. And I think, you know, one other point here that I didn't put on this slide, but that I think is really important is, again, making sure that you're being really aware of those relationships that you're building with the folks that you're serving, because that trust is really important. And again, kind of from Downstream's point of view, you know, we do a lot of these kinds of studies fairly regularly, and people are very tired of being surveyed. There's a lot of surveys that go out all the time, so figuring ways to capitalize on existing data collection systems that you might already have in place can be really, really important for sure. So yeah, I think that's all I've got.
Hey, Andrew and Liberty, this is Leslie. I know I don't have a slide, but I'm wondering if I could weigh in with a couple of ACENET observations at this stage.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I think ACENET has learned over the years is we've struggled to collect data on all 9 of those indicators that were on the earlier slide. I think because we play so many different roles within our local system.
Leslie, we're losing your audio, if you can adjust that.
Okay, can you guys hear me better now?
That's better.
Yes, much better.
Okay, sorry. I'm still snowbound since Friday, so I'm struggling with technology. So just a couple observations, I think, from ACENET. You know, one of our challenges in terms of collecting a lot of those 9 indicators over the last 20 years for us has been all the different hats we wear. So recognizing whatever your role is within your food system, I think, is important and building on the trust and the sort of network relationships you have in terms of the role that you play is also important. So for us at AceNet, when we opened the Food Ventures Center in the mid-90s, a lot of folks were interacting with us because we were providing processing space as well as the training and technical assistance and marketing expertise that folks needed. We're also, like many I'm sure on this phone call, subsidized by grant investments. So there were a lot of indicators that our funders really wanted us to collect. And I think what we've learned over the years is also trying not to fatigue people with too many surveys, but kind of setting the bar early on in our relationship, especially with our tenants or clients who particularly are receiving more in-depth technical assistance, especially marketing assistance. So we use a tool that has been very helpful called an intake process, and we collect a lot of baseline data through our intake form. And we try and do it in such a way that we use it to really tell people that you're part of this larger network, that perhaps some of these questions, some of the information we're requesting might, make you a little uncomfortable, but it's going to be confidential, and really get people engaged that they're joining something larger than themselves. And that collective impact really is going to be important for everyone within our local food economy network. I think the other thing that we've struggled with probably over the years is that we have a lot of different spreadsheets. So we're collecting client data for one funder, maybe using 2 or 3 of those different indicators, but for another funder, maybe a more farm-centric program, we're collecting a whole different set of data. So figuring out, I think for us over the years has been, how do we collate a lot of that data so that we're not going back to the same people for specific information? So for instance, our Athens Farmers Market typically has anywhere from 80 to 100 vendors. AceNet has a long relationship with the Athens Farmers Market, leveraging additional resources for the association and particularly for individual vendor members within the association. If they're a tenant, we might already collect information that we can then add to our larger spreadsheet of indicators for the Athens Farmers Market. And I think, again, respecting people's knowledge or understanding oftentimes of their own business is important. I really enjoyed Annie's comment that not everyone is talking maybe in the same sort of grant jargon like FTEs or part-time equivalents or seasonal employees. So making sure that you're collecting some of this data in such a way that people have an understanding of what they're trying to tell you that they know about their farm operation or about their processing business is important. So we find, I think now, especially as our staff has grown, having individual staff members who might have a more significant role with that client, or for instance with our food hubs and kitchen incubator, have more direct assistance to that tenant, they're the better point person to collect any of the indicators. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie and Annie. Great points all around. Andrew, did you want to pause here for any Q&A that might have come through the chat box before we move into the tools and software section?
Yeah, that's great. If anybody has questions about that section we just covered on sort of the norms and guidelines for collecting data, then please do enter that in the chat box. If it's a particular person that your question is for, you can make a note of that. While we're waiting for questions, any additional comments from folks we just heard from Gail or Mary or Annie in response to Leslie's point, or anything else y'all want to add before we move on?
This is Mary, I would just echo, and really, I'm so glad that y'all pointed out about the sort of leveraging how you already interact with folks. And, whether that's you see the Amish farmers at the market a certain time of the year, or you have your intake process, or maybe if producers are delivering to your market, it's a certain time of the year where when they come in to make their delivery, you ask them the questions at that time. I think that's really important in terms of having that sort of schedule and getting consistent data, and also not overburdening folks. So glad you all pointed that out.
Hey, this is Gabby. There is a question on the chat box from Gail. She's wondering, is there an easy way to count FTE jobs? Maybe explain the fraction used for seasonal.
Great question. Does somebody want to take this?
So this is Leslie. This is how we do it, and I don't know if it's the perfect solution. I think it's particularly challenging sometimes with farmers. So generally, we ask folks, again, reminding them that they should be counting themselves as employees, how many people in that 12-month cycle typically worked full-time, how many typically worked part-time, and then if they had seasonal or interns, many of our organic farmers, for instance, they will have woofers sometimes during the spring and summer months. Then we can kind of from there calculate the fraction again, as Andrew said. We separate employees from seasonal employees and interns. So we have two different columns for those numbers.
Yeah, I'll actually, to Leslie's point, I'll actually show an example of what an employment data collection template would look like, but it is a good question. There are many forms that employment takes, especially on-farm employment, and so the easiest way to lump all that up and put it into the same aggregated number is to use fractions. So again, it's sort of up to people's discretion how much of a full-time job do they think that it is. Is it a quarter of a full-time job? Is somebody only working 10 hours a week or only 3 months a year? If so, that might be a 0.25. If they're working about every other day or 6 months out of the year, that's probably a 0.5, right? So folks can just sort of use their discretion, and the fractions are going to be a good bit more accurate than just saying one job for every person who's involved on the farm, because we know not every form of involvement amounts to a full-time job. So other comments or questions on the employment, the full-time equivalent metric before we move on?
I don't see anything else in the chat bar.
Great. All right. Well, let's talk about this next section, which is the tools and software. In some ways, this gets at Gail's question, some other questions about how you actually collect these numbers, what they actually mean. So if we go to the next slide, the first thing that I'm going to talk through are some of the templates that CAN has actually used over the years. And these are examples. They're not necessarily what you all will want to use, or it might not make sense for everybody, but they're an example of how you can collect aggregated data from multiple organizations for each one of these indicators. So this first one that we're seeing here is the sales. So that's producer revenue or producer sales, whichever way you want to say it. And you can see sort of how this thing is laid out. So in the left column, this is just an Excel spreadsheet. So this is a template that we would share with organizations. Each organization would put in their information, send it back in, and then we would put it all together. So that's a little bit of an older-fashioned way to do it, and we're going to hear about a slightly more streamlined way in a little bit. But this is the way that you would go about collecting that information. So the organization would put in their name, and you can see here the blue line is for each organization, and on the left side there. And then for each organization, you would have past data for them to be able to refer to. Again, this is aggregated data, but total revenue, total number of producers in each previous year, and then they put in the highlighted column there data for the more recent year. And so part of the reason to include the data from the past year is just to remind people what they've said before and what the ballpark of that number looks like, right? To remind people that we need to be counting the same thing, right? That we're all counting the same thing, that it's consistent, and that organizations are counting the same thing year to year, which you might assume, but isn't necessarily a safe assumption. So reminding folks what they've said in previous years so they can make sure that their numbers for this year are more or less in line, that they're counting the same thing. And then you can also plug in a formula to say what has been the growth or decline over the past year for that organization. So that's a formula that you can put in there in that column D that shows the change over the past year. And then down at the bottom, when you aggregate all this stuff back up, you get these filled out by the different organizations, and you plug it all back in here. These formulas at the bottom tell you the totals, right? The total number of producers, the total revenue, the mean revenue, the mean number of producers working with each organization, et cetera. And so that's a great way to see all of the data. This is the raw data. So this would generally stay internally, and you would create some sort of summary or overview to share back out. But this is how you would manage that internally. And that's for sales. So next slide. We'd also do something similar for the buyers, the purchasers, the folks who are purchasing product. And similarly, each organization is tracking this and aggregating it up. They might identify, they probably have individual numbers for each buyer who's purchasing from them, but what we're looking for is the aggregate. So each organization puts in their information, the total purchases. So again, this is different from sales. This isn't the total amount the producers have sold. This is the total amount that large-scale institutional or wholesale buyers have purchased. So it's probably going to be a slightly smaller number because a lot of the purchases are not from institutions or not from wholesale retailers or larger buyers like that. So you can see here, you put in the total purchases and the number of buyers, number of purchasers, and you compare that each year. And again, the formula is calculated up at the bottom. One other optional additional way to think about this, and this is another layer that isn't necessary right off the bat, but it's been really interesting for CAN to see over the years. We have identified subcategories of buyers some years. So we'll say, of all these purchases, how many of those buyers were retailers? How many of those buyers were institutions, hospitals, or universities? How many were school systems? Public school systems, and in that way you can sort of break it out and see which buyers are really driving the demand for these local food products that we're trying to sell more of and grow more of. So that's a really helpful thing to be able to say and be able to see. It is another level of information to collect that might not be feasible right off the bat, but something to think about. Next slide, please. When we're thinking about employment job creation, this is one that's a little bit trickier. As we just heard from the question, it can be difficult to differentiate between all the different types of employment that happen on the farm. And so one way to think about that is, again, we have the organizations in the blue, so each organization would put in their name and then count year to year. So you can see you've got the 2015 data and the 2016 data in here for several different categories. And so so the way that CAN has done it is we actually differentiate between seasonal and year-round, and then fractions represent part-time in each of those categories. So you can see, for example, in 2015, Organization 1 had 82.25 year-round employees. So those are folks who are working more or less 12 months out of the year, and then you use fractions if they're not working full-time this entire 12 months. And so you end up with a fraction number, 82.25. Obviously, that's not a quarter of a person, that's a quarter of a full-time job. And it just helps us keep the data a little bit more accurate than if you're rounding every job up to full-time. And then we also have the number of producers in here as well, 17 producers providing that many with that many employees. That's a way to get around this question of, are farmers counting themselves? So you have each farmer in there already as a producer, and you can figure out if to make sure that that they're counting themselves as jobs and as employees as well. Over this next category, you can see the seasonal employees, so 6 months or less out of the year. And again, asking folks to use fractions for part-time. So those are jobs that might be 3, 4, 5 months out of the year. And again, some of those are going to be full-time, some of those are going to be part-time, so we use fractions there as well. There's another category of unpaid interns or volunteers. So these are folks who are in a learning capacity or service capacity or whatever else, and they're not probably being paid at market rate, but they're getting something in return: food, lodging, learning, etc. And one of the reasons we want to track that is that it's not necessarily as strong of an economic impact as job creation, but what it does show is that there's a pipeline of people who want to work on farms, who are finding ways to be on farms. And that's valuable to understand. And then there's always, it's always useful to have another column to throw in there as well. So next slide, please. The last one I'm going to share, and these all, you can see, follow the same sort of format. And again, make this easy on yourself. We can share this template after the call, and y'all can adapt it to use within your organization or across organizations or wherever else. But they're all following the same sort of format so that they're easier to compare and to collate and aggregate. So again, this one is for investment. For each organization, they put in their numbers for each year. So you can see here, we had 2014, 2015, and we're asking folks to fill in 2016. And so they would fill in the total amount invested, so how much money went into the local food system, how much of that came from sources inside the value chain, and then what the number of investors were. So this sources inside the value chain, again, is optional, but it can be really powerful to be able to pull that out and say, and show that total. So if you look down here at the bottom, you can see, to take 2015, for example, and these are just not complete numbers, but for example, if you had in 2015, $1.6 million of investment in the value chain from 43 investors, 983,000 of that is from internal sources. So those are sources inside the value chain actors, farmers, producers, food businesses, intermediaries who are making those investments. And what that shows, that's a majority of all of the investment. What that shows is that the folks in the food system have skin in the game, that they're putting their money where their mouth is, that they're committing to making this work, and that they're able to do so, which means that there's some financial viability happening, that there is money that can be repaid from investments in the food system. And so that's an important thing to be able to show multiple audiences, including potential investors and including funders who at the beginning may have felt like they were having to spend a lot of grant money to get this thing off the ground. And now you can say, well, look, most of the investment that we now have, we're able to come up with ourselves. And so that shows just an increase in viability, financial viability, and growing to scale. So those are just a few examples of how the nuts and bolts of how you actually get these numbers, right? What it looks like, because at some point it has to be entered in one form or another. And so that's the way that CAN has done it. That might be useful for other sort of internal tracking or for other partnerships across multiple organizations. But when we're talking about a much broader reach, like with this West Virginia Impact pilot, probably old-fashioned Excel documents being emailed and aggregated doesn't make as much sense. So what does make sense? I think next slide, we're going to have somebody from DC2 talk about what they've been using.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So the way we've been collecting the information from organizations for the pilot project is using Google Forms. So this may be a little nuts and bolts for this webinar, but I think it's important for us to look at the tools that are available to collect information, because you know, many of you that are on this call are probably thinking about, not just collecting aggregated information from other organizations, but actually what we would call primary data collection, and actually, asking farmers or businesses for their information. So, in that case, it's difficult to possibly you probably wouldn't want to share around a spreadsheet and have different farmers enter their information into a common spreadsheet, right? Because that would that information is not aggregated, it's private, you want it to be anonymous. So you need to have some way to collect that information and keep it private if you're collecting information from those businesses. So one really easy way, and many of you are probably already using this tool in some form, but Google Forms is a free tool within the Google platform, and there are actually a lot of YouTube videos available to kind of teach you how to use it, and we could probably provide some help with that if anybody's not familiar with it. But it's just a simple way to create a survey. So the screen share capture on the left is kind of an image of the template within the software that how you kind of add the questions, and then you can send out that survey, and then people can enter their responses online. And then what you end up with is all of that information feeds into a spreadsheet. So the screen capture on the right there is an example of the Google Excel sheet that is created, and you can save it confidentially in your Google Drive, or you can download it and use it like you would any Excel spreadsheet. So if you're collecting information from individuals or businesses, you can use this type of tool to gather that information in a private, anonymous way, and then you can aggregate it. So you can sum it all up, and then then once, say you collected 20 responses from different farmers, and once you add all that up, you might find that you have your 82.25 jobs. And then that's that aggregated number that shows up in Andrew's spreadsheet from your organization. So, and we are also, so you can use this kind of tool if you're collecting information as your own organization from your farmers or your businesses that you're working with. We are also using this particular tool for the impact tracking pilot project. So, so folks that want to participate in that, we will be sending this out, and you as your organization can enter your information into here, into the survey. So it's, private or anonymous. If people want to be credited, one of the things we're doing, and is that was referred to in the previous webinar, is that we're creating an annual report. So if you want to, be listed as one of the organizations that contributed information, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. So this is just a way for us to collect all that information and pool it together for the pilot project. So like I said, there's a lot of tools out there, like YouTube videos to show you how to use this, but I think it's just valuable to know that this tool exists and is free, and is another way to do it in addition to spreadsheets. One additional comment is that if your folks that you're trying to survey aren't super tech friendly or savvy, they can fill this out online, right? But you can also use this as a template to punch data into if you're talking to them, if you call them up over the phone, and then the data still all ends up in a spreadsheet. So it's just a way to keep it private and consistent and kind of organized. And that's all I have. Pitch it back to you, Andrew.
All right. So next slide, I think we just want to pause here again and see if folks have any questions on those tools or software, if you could put them into the chat box. As I mentioned, we can make available that Excel spreadsheet template, which again is useful for some things more so than others. As Mary shared, you probably are not going to want to be sending that out to producers to fill in their information. You probably want something a little bit more user-friendly, but that can be a great way to collect it from organizations that already have it and who are used to that Excel software and things. And then we'll talk more about the intake form or input form for the West Virginia pilot project at the end of the call today when we talk about next steps there. So question on internal versus external investors. So most simply, external investors are funders. So they are federal agencies, foundations, folks who are putting money into the system from outside because they want the food system to grow, right? So they're seeing the whole food system. They might be investing in a specific thing, you know, buying a piece of equipment for a food hub, or funding a facility, or supporting, you know, whatever else, shared use processing infrastructure. But they're outside looking in, and they're really important supporters, especially to get over some of those early humps in local food system development and value chain development. Internal investors are those that are actually in the food system, and they're usually investing in things that are meeting their immediate needs. So again, a farmer expanding their production through acquisition of land or purchasing new equipment, or a group getting together and purchasing some shared use facility or shared use equipment, or a food hub financing a new refrigerated truck or whatever else like that. So the difference is that the folks inside the value chain who are getting those investments usually are having to pay them back. And so we're more likely to be measuring things like equity investments, loans and lending, other forms of financing for those investments, as opposed to grants from outside sources, which are often more important in the early stage of food system development and are still important for certain things, but you want to be able to show that your reliance on those outside sources of funding is diminishing over time. That shows that you're resilient, that you're increasingly self-sufficient, and that this food system is becoming more and more economically viable for the folks participating in it. So hopefully that helps get at that piece. Other questions or comments on this section before we move on? All right, so I think the next section is going to be, so we've talked about all this data, and if you decide to collect all this stuff and you have you're doing it according to these norms and these guidelines, and you're using the tools and the software, and you figured all that out, and you gather it all together, and you have the data, now what? And so this next section is about telling the story, communicating your impact, and talking to different audiences. So again, as a reminder, this was something we talked about a little bit at the last webinar, but why is it important to measure impact in the local food system? There's a few different obvious things that I'll say again to frame all this up, and we're going to talk more about specific audiences. Overall, what we're trying to do, and this is for Ken at least, and probably as well for many of you, we want to make a case that local food systems work is a legitimate, meaningful, significant economic development strategy. And you do that by showing that it has tangible results, right? This is not, local food systems are not a charity case. They are a real, meaningful economic driver that have important impacts for farmers, food producers, consumers, and communities in West Virginia. And to be able to make that case, we need data that shows those things. Having data and having a good measurement system in place also increases the credibility of the organizations doing this work, right? Credibility in the face of funders, of policymakers, of community supporters, of farmers, people who want to say, people who might ask, okay, so you think this food system thing is worthwhile, but how do you know? How can you show me that these investments are paying off, that there is growing demand, that there are market opportunities for entering this space? It also increases the alignment of the organizations doing this work. So if everybody on this call adjusts a little bit towards each other in terms of what you're all already doing, that's going to benefit everybody. And so the more we're thinking together about measurement and using the same language and the same concepts and the same tools, the more our work is going to be mutually reinforcing and mutually supportive. We also want to be able to influence the funders and the decision makers. And a few examples here that have been influenced in some form or other over the years The Appalachia Funders Network is one. These are all the funders in the region who are investing in food systems work, or in any work, but specifically those investing in food systems have a case that they can take and they can make to other funders to convince them to get involved to invest in food systems work. It's one of their core focus areas. Same goes for the Appalachian Regional Commission. In their strategic plan, they talk about food systems, local foods, as one of the important, growing, promising sectors, and a number of other publications that they've done. And they need the data to be able to make that case. And they're not necessarily going to be able to come up with all that data themselves. So when you provide them the case, they're able to carry that water, and they're able to carry it on to bigger audiences. This National Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders Network, they're another organization that we were able to take all this regional data and say, look at how organized Central Appalachia is. Look at how the organizations are collaborating. Look at how we're working together to plug gaps in the local food system. Look at how we're measuring the same things and talking about the same ways. And they were blown away. And that is how you attract outside investment, new funders, new investment, new interest into a region, is by showing that you have momentum, that you have progress, that you have traction. And that brings us to the last one, which is to just show this regional momentum. Everybody feels it. You can feel that Appalachia's local food economy, or West Virginia's local food economy, is doing something special. But we need data to be able to show what exactly is happening, that it is driving economic development and diversification, that it is impacting small farmers and businesses, that it is improving health and food access. And that big picture is increasing the resilience of our local food system and of our state and regional economy. Next slide, please. And then you have to bring those messages to different audiences, and you have to tailor the message to different audiences because they need different meanings attached to the numbers. The numbers by themselves often don't tell a story. They can be misinterpreted. They can be used different ways. They might mean more to someone and not as much to someone else. So be thinking about what each audience wants to hear, and we're going to dive into each of these. But some of the main audiences, funders, they want proof of impact. They want to know that you're making a difference. They care about the changes that are happening on the ground, things like jobs, things like producer revenue, things like businesses. Policymakers, they want stories about economic growth, and they're most interested when you're talking to them about things that resonate with their talking points and their policy priorities. Again, jobs, businesses, but also votes and voters, and the number of people who are engaged in this local food system and who care about the policies that affect the local food system. Farmers, they want to know that the sector that they're committing to is economically viable and has growth opportunity. They want to know that there are supports in place, that there are markets available to them, and there's demand for what they're trying to do, and there's support in the community for what they're trying to do, and that they're not going it alone. Consumers, we're all consumers one way or the other. We want to feel good about our impact, and one of the main things that consumers are paying more and more attention to is their food purchasing and the impact of their food purchasing. So we need to make sure we're communicating to them. And then the last one, buyers and market partners. This is oftentimes how we reach a broader base of consumers, but they want to know that there's a whole local food system that's growing to meet demand. So the buyers need to know that producers are getting organized, that they're increasing their production capacity, that they're growing the products that the markets are needing, and that the infrastructure is in place or being developed to be able to get those products to market. And buyers, if they're confident that you can give them what they need, then they're much more likely to invest, to be flexible with you, to work with you, to promote your products, to provide the pricing that you need, all these other things. So that's just a snapshot of the audiences that we want to be thinking about, and we're going to dive into each of those. And the first one, if you go to the next slide, is policymakers. So policymakers is a really interesting and important one. I think we're going to have some examples from West Virginia here, but a couple things you want to emphasize when you're thinking about policymakers: sector growth, jobs, businesses. And one that I feel like we forget sometimes is votes, right? If you can say, look, we've got not only thousands of farmers growing locally here in West Virginia who care about the policies that are enacted that are affecting their work. We also have all of these other consumers. So we have 1,000 farmers, so we've got 3,000 people who've engaged, members of the public who've engaged with local food events or activities or whatever else. That's a lot of votes, and that's the sort of thing that will get the attention of policymakers. So I think we're going to hear from some examples. Food and Farm Coalition, I'm not sure if it's Spencer or somebody else on there, has had some good wins around getting policy change at the state level by showing what a difference it would make for the state's farmers. So somebody from the Food and Farm Coalition want to share about those examples?
Yeah, hey guys, this is Spencer from the Food and Farm Coalition. I just kind of wanted to share a couple what we like to call war stories from our work in the past. So a couple things I just want to say is that lawmakers really, really love anecdotal stories. They definitely kind of capture their attention more than numbers, but you know, it almost always comes back to the numbers. So one of the things we try to do is pair anecdotal stories with the numbers, and the trifecta, of course, is if we can get somebody from their district to say all of that, that goes a lot further than me or a lobbyist or a board member saying that. So I just kind of want to put that out there in terms of, you know, how we share this information is getting, you know, our farmers to kind of make these statements, and breaking down the information in a way that they're able to make these statements is really helpful. And, you know, part of our work is getting those pieces into place so that our farmers can make those statements. But in terms of numbers, I think the two biggest questions that I always get at the legislature are, you know, how many people does blah, blah, blah bill affect in terms of farms or businesses? And why aren't we, you know, there's a $8 billion food bill in West Virginia or whatever that number happens to be this year. Why aren't we meeting, you know, X amount or any of that? And so those are the two biggest questions that I get. So being able to answer those questions in the context of any bills is always really helpful. So then in terms of food stories, you know, I definitely got that question. A lot of you folks know we worked on a cottage foods bill the last 2 years, working on it again this year, of course. You know, one of the things in terms of numbers that they always want to know is how many people are likely to do this? So, you know, being able to answer that question, it was the same question. We're working on expanding a rabbit processing rule, same question. And now we're working on an agritourism bill, so to limit the liability for agritourism businesses. And I was talking to a lawmaker last week, and we were talking about numbers of businesses that this bill might affect. And she kind of had it in her mind that there was like 3 to 5 agritourism businesses in the state. And when I popped back with, well, actually, we have 55 on our list of people we're talking to, she was blown away that it was that many farms. And then she was also pretty impressed that we were able to pop out with that number. So I think that was really helpful and really kind of encouraged her to help support this particular bill, because that, you know, she's used, you know, dollar signs in her district. And most West Virginia lawmakers really like to see anything that like supports small business. Something particularly I've come to notice. And so, you know, kind of honing in on these numbers is helpful. And then in terms of another war story, in terms of institutional price preferencing, one of the conversations I had with a lawmaker last year, because their question to us was, you know, how much money in institutional purchasing is even going on? Could we even meet any of it? And so the story we spun was, and unfortunately I can't remember these numbers from last year because I think I block out every legislative session after it's over. But, you know, West Virginia in 2016 did, you know, for easy numbers, did, you know, $1 million of institutional purchasing, which did far more than that. What would happen if we were able to capture 10% of that, $100,000? Of those funds being reinvested right back into West Virginia small businesses, aka farms, right back into West Virginia communities, as opposed to that money leaving the state. And then the next question was always, well, could we even meet that? And so the fun part around this is that we were, you know, doing this pilot last year So we were able to kind of we had some numbers rolling around. We were able to pop back and say, well, we did $2 million in the state last year, so we could definitely meet this number. And so that sort of turned some heads. So those are just some anecdotes and some war stories about how all of this fits into lawmakers. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it back over to Andrew, I believe.
That's super helpful, Spencer. Thanks so much. Great war stories there from the Food and Farm Coalition, who wake up thinking about this audience every day. Was there some examples from DC2 as well here before we move on?
I don't have a lot to share, Andrew. Food and Farm Coalition is definitely the leader on the policy work for our state. The only thing I would say is that occasionally, the policymakers do make rounds and do listening sessions. And I know just as something we can do as organizations on this call, our businesses, is be aware of that and, work with organizations like the Food and Farm Coalition to capitalize on those opportunities and show up with our numbers, and also, encourage those farmers or business owners that are making those impacts out there to appear and weigh in at those types of listening sessions. So that's something we haven't had a direct interaction much with policy, but that's something we have encouraged is business owners to participate in that sort of thing. That's all.
Great. So yeah, just thinking about all the stakeholders in this local food system who really represent a pretty significant constituency if they are organized and connected and empowered to sort of speak up together on the issues that they care about. So next slide. This one is about funders, and we're going to talk about a few different categories of funders here. And I think, Leslie, you were going to take the lead on this one.
Sure. So I think, we've covered some of this, but just to drill down a little deeper, I think we all understand that when many of us secure grant funding, that there's going to be a lot of different metrics that we need to count. And so much of the investment that has come through to our local food economies, particularly from federal funders like the various USDA agencies, as well as the significant investment we've had in recent years from the Appalachian Regional Commission, their expectation is that we're doing a good job collecting that economic impact data. So really emphasizing, business starts, business improvement, jobs retained, jobs created are oftentimes going to be those metrics that we need to be able to make sure that we're communicating those impacts for a year, a 2-year, or even longitudinally. We want to be able to keep collecting that data to demonstrate to our federal partners that they've made a wise investment. I think we've also seen, different investments from local foundations to national foundations, that philanthropy is very interested in measuring collective impact, probably much more in the last 5 or 10 years than in decades previous. Philanthropy also, I think, has done a great job innovating and taking leadership to make sure that our food economies are both engaging low-income entrepreneurs, but also benefiting low-income consumers. So we know we've had funding in the past, especially from USDA, the Farmers Market Promotion Program grant, particularly the Community Food Project funds, have all emphasized making sure that we're creating healthy food access for low-income consumers. So if you've utilized that in the past, you know what those metrics look like, and I think philanthropy wants that information, obviously, as well. The other funders that I think we also have to recognize for many of our organizations are that we have significant donations from individuals in our communities. There's oftentimes sponsorships or other for-profit enterprises that really sustain our programs. So whether you're a membership organization, whether you're a nonprofit, you've probably benefited from private donations, from individual memberships to sponsorships for events to long-time sustainers, folks who are investing long-term in your program work. So being able to really recognize those folks as an audience and making sure that you're sharing indicators that are going to be meaningful to them is important. The other trend that we've been trying to figure out how to map and track, I guess, at ACENET is more and more of the nonprofit partnerships and many of the individual farmers or processors are using new tools like crowdfunding. And we've been trying to be good stewards of measuring that impact in southeastern Ohio because I think it says a couple things. One, it says that there's dedicated consumers who want to see the local food system grow. They're demanding more choice, and they're putting their dollars up to make sure that our individual farm operators or processors are getting additional equity in many ways to be able to start or expand their operations. So I guess the message here, certainly in West Virginia, 800 participating producers means more and more West Virginia farmers see the local food economy as a viable career. And then I think moving on to the next slide. Gail, you might want to add a little bit more here about the Wild Ramp and some of the funder engagement that you've experienced in the recent years.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. In 2014, we were visited by the Appalachian Regional Commission and by representatives of Dean Earl Gold, who's a wonderful human being, and we're going to miss him, but also a representative of the EPA and the USDA, and they were doing a program called Livable Communities in Appalachia, and we had applied for that and were one of the communities that were awarded that technical assistance grant. It didn't come with much money until we were finished, and there was a lot of work up front, but the process of doing all of that work and gathering all the stakeholders from around the city and community and the tri-state area actually was a huge benefit to us. And we spent a few days talking about our goals and what we wanted our local food system to look like. And we came up with 4 main goals that we wanted to meet. And we worked that year on those goals. And the next year, Melissa Kramer of the EPA contacted me and said she was going to be presenting somewhere and could she talk about us. And I said yes, and let me go back and look and see, if we've reached any of our benchmarks or where we are on reaching those benchmarks. And we had exceeded, with the help of many of our partners, including Refresh Appalachia as a huge piece, we had exceeded 3 of the 4 goals that we've set in 1 year's time. So as a result of that report that I sent to Melissa, they featured us on the EPA website as a successful project. And then this summer, when we went, Lauren and I went to a conference in DC about livable communities. They asked me to speak to Scott Pruitt, who's the administrator of the EPA, and explain to him why local food is important to communities and to economic development. And that was there's a picture of that over there. And that's kind of funny because he wasn't listening to me at all until I told him about the $6 billion, or maybe it's an $8 billion Spencer opportunity now for West Virginia, and how it could be a real economic driver. That got his attention. So we've got to keep talking about that, and we've got to keep getting them to pay attention to what the real economic drivers can be here.
The last thing I would like to add, I guess, on funders too, is you guys in West Virginia have just done this fantastic job telling your stories at a regional level using social media tools. So I would say a huge piece of the Wild Ramp success is just the utilization of your Facebook page and getting the story out, sharing metrics, but also putting a face on the impacts of these metrics. So having funders, you know, who, number one, are following us on all our social media platforms and then reposting a lot of our stories is also very, I would say, important to them, because they're demonstrating to their constituencies, whether it's their board, whether it's other elected officials, that this impact is valid, and it really puts a sense of faith in place on the work that we're doing.
Back to you, Andrew.
All right, so next slide, talking about an audience, and I want to hear from our partners on the call about this one. Farmers, right? So this is in many ways our primary audience. They're the folks that we're serving or working for or working with, and that we really care about. So it's the reason we're doing this work for the most part. So what do they need to know? What do they need to hear in terms of data and impact and measurement? As I've said before, I think the thing to emphasize is that there's sector growth and there are opportunities to have viable livelihoods in this space, and you can make that case by showing the unmet demand, by this mainstream demand, by the growth in sales year after year, the growth in the number of producers year after year, and really communicating this message that there's growing demand for local food, and so you don't have to worry about people wanting to buy what you're growing because it'll be there. And then there's another piece that needs to go along with those numbers, which is to say you're also not doing this alone, right? There are lots of people, lots of organizations working to make this food system function, working to provide support, working to lower barriers to entry into the local food system, barriers to entry into the markets, things like that. So letting farmers know of all the support that is available to them, that they're not going to be out there on their own, they're not going to have to figure everything out on their own, that there's actually a lot that has already been figured out for them or that's available to them to take advantage of. So there's some great examples in West Virginia, obviously, VC2 with their technical assistance and business training and marketing and things like that, Starting Farms, the apprenticeship program, and I'm sure many others. So would any of y'all like to comment on just sort of how you message this to farmers to encourage them to get involved and to show them that there is opportunity and demand for what they're doing?
This is Annie. I think, you know, the one piece that I've seen this used, and this is maybe a little bit more from the perspective of downstream, but being able to show market opportunities to farmers has been pretty impactful for both through, you know, work as downstream, but also working with, when we worked with Alderson Food Hub and Winter Farm Market and some of those entities, you know, because if you're able to show that there is a growing market and there is a demand, you know, that can really kind of inspire people to think about producing in a different way or think about expansion in a meaningful way if they understand what the potential market is.
That's good stuff, Annie. And we have also been working with Appalachian Sustainable Development in Abingdon, Virginia, and ACENET in Athens, along with a lot of other partners around the state of West Virginia, to grow the opportunity for selling into wholesale markets. And through that work, we started out with 7 GAP certified farmers in the state, and now we have more than 14 at least, maybe more. We've had, Katie, maybe if you're still on the call, you could throw in the number of how much wholesale money was generated, income was generated in West Virginia from that program. Are you still here? Leslie, do you know that number off the top of your head? I don't.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. I'm not sure. I don't think we have an exact number. But again, I think we've demonstrated, definite growth, just in terms of some of the CAN data we've been collecting.
Right. So anyway, those kinds of opportunities we need to talk more about and make more public to farmers so that they can understand that there is a growth opportunity.
Great. Next slide. The last slide we'll talk about, and then we'll move into the wrap up for this call. Our consumers. So this includes sort of broader community engagement, but at the end of the day, the local food system only works if people are buying the product. And so we need to think about consumers and how we talk to them, how we share numbers and stories with them, so they can feel good about their role and see the importance of their role in supporting local farmers and supporting food businesses and buying local, also in participating, to showing up, engaging at events, in advocacy campaigns as constituents, things like that. And the message here is really to know your farmer, to connect with them, to keep your money local and keep your impact local, and then to vote with your wallet, and of course to vote as well, but to make decisions, financial decisions as a consumer that are in line with your values and in line with what you want to support, especially in the local food system. So if we go to the next slide, I think, again, WildRamp has done a good job of this, and one of the mediums has been this annual impact report that we've got on this slide.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. The WildRamp put together an annual report for 2017. That makes no sense. It was for 2016, I'm sorry. It was published in 2017, but the report was for the fiscal year 2016. I just put one page of the report up to show the number of producers, the sales, how many dollars went to the producers, because we're a consignment market. Telling sales doesn't tell the whole story, because some of the sales are wholesale and some of them are consignment, but we can say that we gave or didn't give, but that farmers earned $130,000 in consignment sales. And we track WIC and Siemens farmers market voucher sales and SNAP sales and jobs created. These are jobs that were created since we started, and the number of partnerships and the number of events that we've had. So we work really hard to engage the consumer and have a lot of community events. Our biggest, well, we have two big ones. The spring is Stinkfest, or the Ramp Festival, and then in the fall we have a farm to table dinner out on the street in front of the market. But that's, I think, all there is, unless somebody has a question for me.
That's great, Gail. So yeah, the idea here is that all of this is public facing, right? Folks want to feel like they're part of this, so when they see those numbers, they see that they are a part of the reason that all of that is happening, that all of that is possible. So WildRamp does a really good job with that. We're about to wrap up, and so I want to go ahead and prompt people to start putting questions into the chat box, and because they'll take a while, it takes a while to type them in, and for us to get them and read them back out. And so as folks are thinking about your questions, anything that you've heard here on the call today, or if it's for a specific person, or if it's something that we didn't talk about that you're wondering about, do put that into the chat box. In the meantime, I think we'll go ahead and talk about some of the next steps for the West Virginia pilot project. If Mary or Liberty wants to take that, it's on the next slide.
Sure. Great. So yeah, on the last webinar, we talked more details about what the pilot project is doing, but basically what we're trying to do is work with organizations like many of you on the call to capture this impact, right? So the two goals of the project were to help individual organizations kind of get better at tracking our own metrics, and then increasing our possibilities of participating in this collaborative project. So the goal is to just pool our impact and really elevate and amplify the message about the impact that y'all are having out there. And we think one way to do this is by working together to pull this information together and put it into a report, which we can share with everybody, so that not only can it be used at the state level by like the Food and Farm Coalition to communicate some of this impact, but also individual organizations can use it with your own stakeholders to say, you know, this is the impact the network is having, this is how local food is growing in the state, and this is our role in it, and this work is really important. So it's, you know, I think it's not just about the numbers, it's also about the process and the value of the relationships and the community around this work. And that, you know, these people, the producers, aren't just numbers out there, they're people and there are organizations supporting them, and this is, you know, having an economic impact. So the next steps of this project, we're right now, the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition and is working on this this draft graphic to communicate the information. Like I said, we had the pilot project run in this past year. We had 14 organizations participate. We're really hoping to increase that and get more folks to participate this year, and have a really impactful graphic and report to share. So in order to collect 2017 data, we're going to be sending out the survey here quickly in February. We're also going to be providing some best practices guidance for, you know, collecting those metrics, which is going to be largely based on these webinars. Again, all the data that you might want to contribute to this project will be aggregated and maintained confidentially within West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition. And other organizations, we're having a support role, but that data will be maintained confidentially only there. The impact report will have talking points, so that once we do collect all of this information and put it into a report like this, you will have some talking points to use when you try to communicate about it. So we want to make it really easy. So if you want to be involved in this collaborative project, let us know. Here's a survey link, and I think we'll also copy it into the chat box. Let us know. It asks just a couple questions. It's pretty short, about what help you might need to be able to participate and how you'd like to be involved. So like I said, the more we can get participation in this, the more amplified and the more powerful the message will be. And hopefully we can really help it use it to help promote your work and the impact you're having. So thanks everybody, we'll copy that in, and that's all I have. So I guess we didn't talk about who was going to wrap this up, Andrew. The next slide is just, again, it has the survey link and a couple other links to some of the things that were talked about in the past 2 webinars. So I will kick it back to you, Andrew, and maybe we can take questions and answers at this point.
Yeah, so great to have some concrete next steps. Folks will get materials as follow-up from this webinar, some of the tools that we mentioned that we'll share in terms of templates, recording of both webinars and the slides that were used on both webinars. So you'll have that information ready to hand whenever you need it. And then also some exciting next steps for this pilot project itself. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so I want to see if any of the presenters or speakers have additional comments or questions they'd like to add. And again, folks, don't be shy about entering your questions in the chat box. We got a few more minutes here, so we'll see if we have anything else to talk about. But any additional thoughts, comments, questions from our presenters or speakers today?
So this is Leslie. My closing comment would just urge everyone that's on the call and webinar today to really think about the role you could play. You know, whether you want to participate or not, there might be other partners that you work with that you would like to encourage. This is really an unusual project. I mean, I think, and Andrew can maybe chime in, but I think West Virginia is the first state that is really trying to innovate a metrics collection at this scale. So you guys are in the lead, and I think a lot of us in other subregions in Central Appalachia can learn from your example. This is a real model program, and it will be exciting to see it move forward in West Virginia.
That's a great point, Leslie, and it is absolutely true. And you all probably aren't aware of this because you are working in the West Virginia context, and so you see the progress you've been making. But as Leslie says, when you compare West Virginia to other states, y'all are by far the best connected, best networked state, certainly in the region, and probably much more broadly than that, both in terms of how well the individual organizations are working together. And then as this pilot project expands and grows, y'all are going to be in a position to do something that is going to be really, really special, which is to have a bottom-up, community-based, collaborative, participatory approach to statewide impact assessment of your local food system. So again, really exciting stuff, lots of incredible work that we're able to build on here with this project, and really exciting to see where it goes next. So that would be my final comment. Anything else from any of the other presenters, speakers?
This is Gail. I just want to thank you and Leslie for doing this with us and helping us pull things together even better. I'm excited to see what we're going to find this year. And thanks everyone else for being on the call.
Yeah, thanks. This is Annie at Downstream, and yeah, I just want to echo that and say thanks to everybody for pulling this together, and I'm really excited to see everyone working on this because it's something that, you know, I know, once again, based out of the research focused background I've been wishing we had for a long time, and I'm really excited that everyone's working together to pull it together. It's an exciting time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone. This is Liberty with VC2. I just want to note really quickly that I'm not sure what this GoToMeeting software is going to do at 1 o'clock. Since our meeting is scheduled just up until that point, it could kick us off. So if we do get kicked off, just that's why. But thank you to everyone for joining us for both webinars. Thank you to everyone who presented and contributed to the content, and definitely thank you to Leslie and Andrew for guiding us along in this process and offering your technical assistance support via CAN. Definitely thank you to USDA and ARC for the funding that makes this work possible. And again, thanks for being here. We'll send out the resources just as soon as we can get them all pulled together. And we do hope that everyone who's been listening in and following along will consider joining us this year for the next phase of this exciting pilot. Woohoo!
Right.
All right, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you so
you.
much. Stay warm out there,
Thanks,
and
everyone.
we'll talk to you soon. And thank you to the Food and Farm Coalition as well. I definitely want to plug you all for your hard work in policy and advocacy, and for you know, being our leaders on this, and helping us maintain and work with this data as we move forward.
Thank you all for having us and working with us to make this all possible.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'm sure we will talk with you soon.
Sounds good. Talk to you everyone later.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.